The density of the clouds was beyond his monocle's hyperoptic sight. The Bellerophon's instruments and Fielding's instinct were the only things keeping them on course. Even in the midst of the storm, his senses were at their highest amidst the aether. Beneath the exterior pandemonium, his keen ears could make out the hum of the Bellerophon's titanic engines, the pumping of pistons, the grinding of massive gears. If he listened closely, he could even hear the frozen rain battering against the ship's rigid airbag. "Current altitude 10,000 feet, Commander," announced the navigator. "You don't suppose this storm will hinder our imperative, do you, Commander?" dictated the Admiral. "No, sir," replied Fielding, without turning to face his superior. "The Bellerophon is more than capable of withstanding a bit of bad weather." "Good," growled Admiral Roquefort. "Then by day's end we should be—" But the Grand Admiral's words were halted by a cry from one of the crew. "Commander, I'm reading something odd." "Elaborate, Mr. Lambert," commanded Fielding, turning to face the crewman. The man stood before an instrument mounted on the cabin's wall, staring incredulously at what it read. "I'm reading a drastic spike in etheric resonance levels." "How extreme?" asked Fielding, still calm in his tone. "Impossibly extreme, sir. The needle is going off the scale." There was panic in the airman's voice. "There's no naturally occurring etheric gas that resonates on this level." "Then what in blazes is your instrument reading, man?" barked the Grand Admiral. "I'd say it was reading that, Admiral," Fielding stated clearly. "What?" The Admiral's breath vanished at the sight beyond the glass. Every eye on the bridge looked on in astonishment. Two of the men crossed themselves. The helmsman cursed, but no one paid heed. The storm that raged around them had warped into something aberrant and inconceivable. The clouds were seething and frothing with tumultuous force. It was as if the sky was boiling. The thunder was perpetual, the lightning was incessant. No sooner had one bolt faded from sight than another one cleaved through the ether. Even the clouds themselves seemed to be glowing with a radiant purple hue as they swirled in cyclonic fury. It was a sight that not even the most seasoned of airmen aboard the Bellerophon had ever seen before. No one could look away. Every man on the bridge was petrified with awe. They would have stood gaping at the cyclonic maw of madness for hours, if the ship had not been suddenly struck against its airbag. The Bellerophon lurched to one side, throwing most of the men to the floor. A piercing alarm sounded throughout the decks, and the lights flashed red. Commander Fielding, having steadied himself on the platform rail, called over the uproar. "Status report!" The crew scrambled to their feet and dashed to their instruments. "The envelope's open!" cried one of the crewmen. "We're losing lift!" "Engage secondary membrane, decrease propeller speed, and deploy wing sails," the commander instructed. The crewmen rushed to obey. With the turn of a crank, the secondary membrane slid into position over the ship's punctured airbag, sealing the aperture. With the throw of a lever, the port and starboard wing sails extended, catching an updraft and halting the Bellerophon's lurch. Having regained his composure, the helmsman turned to Commander Fielding and reported, "Altitude maintained, sir. We've lost 15% lift. Secondary membrane is holding." Admiral Roquefort turned to Fielding, furrowing his brow. "That wasn't the wind, Commander," he growled. "That was a shell." The ship had been fired upon. Commander Fielding knew this, but he was unable to agree with the Admiral, for the bridge was once again filled with a piercing siren. "Vessel above port!" cried the navigator. "Return fire!" spat the Admiral, gripping the rail and lunging forward. "Now!" The commander did not dispute his superior's order, though he already knew what the gun deck's answer would be. His eyes darted from corner to corner of the windshield wall, searching for what his instinct told him was hiding outside in the storm. Just then, the gun deck's answer sounded over the loudspeaker. "We can't get a lock on it! It's too fast!" The Admiral clenched his fist tighter around the rail. He stormed down from the command deck and over to the navigator's station. "What is its signature?" he barked at the navigator. Commander Fielding's eyes did not leave the storm. "It doesn't register," he muttered, anticipating the navigator's response. "It doesn't register. We can't identify it," the navigator answered, his voice shaking. "It showed up on the radar for a moment, and now it's vanished." Admiral Roquefort slammed his fist down on the navigation panel. Every man but the commander jumped at the sound. "Where in hellfire did it go?" roared the Admiral. Just then, Commander Fielding heard it. His keen ears had caught the unmistakable sound of titanic, ticking, clockwork movements. Closing his eyes, he immediately knew where it was. "Turn on the bow lamps," he declared clearly and loudly. Every eye in the cabin turned to him. "Illuminate the storm, Mr. Kemp." The helmsman hit two large buttons on the side of the wheel, and in an instant the Bellerophon's lights shone out into the tumult, just in time to illuminate the hostile vessel as it sailed past the bow. The figurehead was the first thing to cross through the light. It was far from any conventional bow ornament. It was not the crafted semblance of a maiden or entity for which the ship was named, nor the deity which it honored. It was a skull, made of brass and at least 10 feet from jaw to crown. Its teeth were copper and steel, and there were 3 long iron spikes protruding from the left side of its cranium. An aperture on its right side revealed an array of internal mechanical movements. Its left eye socket was bare, but in its right one there was embedded a spirally engraved iron sphere. Every man but the commander jumped as it loomed past the Bellerophon's windshield. He recognized the skull and the ship that it adorned. As the vessel glided past, even the Grand Admiral gasped at the words MHS Hysteria in polished brass letters on its armored wooden hull. Those who had never heard of the notorious airship would have thought it odd that it was not spelled HMS. But all hands on board the Bellerophon knew that it was not Her Majesty's ship that they faced. It was the Mad Hatter's ship. They would have stared breathless at the infamous vessel for hours, had the sound of the telegraphone not interrupted the silence. "Incoming transmission!" exclaimed the radio technician, swiftly returning to his station. All eyes but those of the commander turned to the technician, whose eyes widened in confusion as he read aloud the message. "Put the kettle on." There was a pause as the riddle hovered in the air amidst the bewildered crewmen, all twisting their brains, trying to comprehend it. Only Commander Fielding understood what it meant, and he said nothing. "Hard to starboard!" roared the Admiral. "Turn about and open fire!" As the crew rushed to their stations, Commander Fielding kept his gaze fixed on the Hysteria. He knew better than to take his eyes off of this ship. Amidst the disarray of the frightened airmen hurrying back and forth and the Grand Admiral barking orders, Fielding paused every sense but sight and tapered his focus on the sky to the minutest iota. He didn't know exactly what he expected to see, but he wouldn't blink to let it past him. And just as the Hysteria's stern glided past the Bellerophon's bow lamps, Fielding caught sight of it. From the stern of the fantastical ship there shot a shadowed shape, The commander could not make out its countenance from the distance, but he could distinguish a pair of membranous wings about 10 feet in span, and beneath them a pair of kicking legs. The shape glided impossibly against the storm's relentless winds, leaving a jet of steam in its wake. Closer and closer the thing shot toward the Bellerophon, and not until it had come within 20 fathoms of the bow did Fielding recognize who it was and what he was carrying. It was a hand cannon. "Get down!" burst the commander, but there was no time for the crew to respond. The cannon shell shattered through the glass shield, exploding in mid-air and releasing a cloud of thick steam that filled the cabin. The airmen shouted and stumbled in blind panic, and amidst the confusion, no one heard the glass breaking a second time. No one but Commander Fielding, who was listening for it. The aperture in the windshield brought the tempest's deafening voice echoing through the cabin. Admiral Roquefort's voice was just loud enough for the crew to make out the order to engage the storm barrier. The helmsman staggered through the steam, fumbling with his hands until he found the lever. The thick metal shutters slid shut over the windshield, silencing the external discord. "Open the fan vents!" barked the admiral. One of the men grappled for the vent switch, and the veil of steam was gradually dissipated, revealing that the Bellerophon had been boarded. In the center of the cabin, standing like a cavalier, was the most unusual man any soldier on board the Bellerophon had ever seen. He stood at about 6 feet tall, in striped brown pants and a brown linen shirt. The brass buttons on his black vest matched the buckles on his boots. On the left side of his chest was embedded a circular brass apparatus that some of the crewmen could identify as a clockwork heart. The bow tie around his neck was nearly as ridiculous as the brass goggles around his face. He held a compact hand cannon in his right hand, and rested his left against a wide leather tool belt he wore about his waist, on which were an array of tools and devices that most of the crew couldn't identify. His brown hair and beard were wild and unkempt. Mounted on his back was what resembled a double-boiler jetpack, with 2 vast wings made from a thick fiber membrane held by a steel frame. A striking machine, but not the main object of the crew's attention. For upon the trespasser's head sat the most impossibly bizarre top hat unimaginable. On the face of its 12-inch tower there was an epicyclic clockwork mechanism, turning continuously and driving a myriad of internal movements that ticked and whirred like a mechanical symphony. On the hat's left side, a brass chimney billowed steam continuously upward, while on the right side 2 miniature Tesla coils surged electricity between each other. With the exception of Commander Fielding, the crew had only ever seen the hat on the wanted posters, as well as the manic face that now grinned widely at them. The crew didn't need to wait for an order to draw their arms, though none of them could find the strength to fire. "Hello, me lads and lovelies!" exclaimed the madman, smiling at the trembling guns pointed at his face. "Have you put the kettle on?"